In 1440, in the misty lands of French Brittany, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom was chained like an animal. Gilles de Laval, Baring de Retz, Marshal of France, compagnon in arms to Joan of Arc, hero of Orleans, advisor to King Charles VII, was dragged to the Episcopal court of Nantes under accusations that would make any man tremble. But these were no ordinary accusations of treason or heresy. They were accusations of something far worse, something the Church called a demonic pact, something the peasants whispered at night, afraid to speak aloud, werewolf. The morning of the trial began with fog, a fog so dense it covered the streets of Nantes like a shroud, and inside the cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul, 300 people pressed together to witness what would be the most shocking trial of the 15th century. The accused was no ordinary criminal. He was one of the richest men in Europe. He owned 15 castles. He had commanded armies. He had saved France from the English, and now he knelt there before Bishop Jean de Malestroit, accused of murdering more than 100 children. But there was something strange about that trial, something the scribes recorded, but official history would later try to erase. Among the formal accusations of homicide, necromancy, and heresy, there was a word that appeared repeatedly in the documents: transformation. The prosecutors did not use the word werewolf directly, but they described something worse. They described a man who, according to witnesses, assumed bestial form during his atrocities, who roared like a beast when consuming human flesh, who lost all human reason, and acted according to predatory instincts. Gilles de Retz looked at the jury with empty eyes. He did not deny. He did not protest. He only asked that they read the accusations in Latin, so the people would not understand the details. The bishop refused. He wanted everyone to know. He wanted the horror to be public. And so, before 300 witnesses, the scribe Pierre de l'Hospital began reading the indictment. And with each line, the silence in the cathedral became denser, more suffocating, because what was being revealed was not just one man's crime. It was the revelation that the monster from fairy tales was real and wore golden armor. 20 years before that trial, Gilles de Retz was considered one of France's greatest heroes. Born in 1404, heir to one of Britain's noblest lineages, he grew up amid war. The 100 Years' War was devastating the kingdom. The English occupied Paris. King Charles VII could barely keep his crown. And it was in this chaos that Gilles found his purpose: war. At 20, he already commanded troops. Tall, strong, skilled with the sword, he was admired by soldiers and feared by enemies. In 1427, he led the assault on Lude Castle and killed the English commander with his own hands. The following year, he conquered the fortress of Renifert. His reputation grew. His fortune took. He married Catherine de Thouars, heiress to vast properties, and became one of the richest men in the kingdom. But it was in 1429 that his name would become legend. When a young peasant woman from Domremy appeared at court claiming to hear divine voices and promising to liberate Orleans, many laughed. But Gilles did not laugh. He saw something in that young woman. Perhaps faith, perhaps madness, or perhaps he recognized in her something he himself carried: the thirst for transformation. Joan of Arc was authorized to lead an army, and Gilles de Retz was assigned to accompany her. He was beside her when the walls of Orleans were liberated. He was in the moat when an arrow wounded her beneath the walls of Paris. and he was in Reims when King Charles was crowned. Carrying the royal banner he had brought from the Abbey of Scilla, was named Marshal of France at 25. It was the peak of glory, but something inside him had begun to change. Joan of Arc was captured by the Burgundians in 1430, sold to the English, burned alive in Rouen. Gilles was not there to save her, and that destroyed him. He withdrew from court. He returned to his castles in Brittany, and it was there, in the shadowy towers of Tiffauges and Machecoul, that the hero disappeared. And something darker took his place. The first disappearances began in 1432. Children. Always children. Boys between 7 and 15 years old. Sons of peasants, artisans, small merchants. They disappeared near the castles of Gilles de Retz. No one dared accuse him directly. He was Marshal of France, a war hero, a powerful nobleman. But the rumors grew, and the bodies were never found. Gilles now lived in seclusion. His castles became impenetrable fortresses. Only trusted servants entered. He set up a private chapel where strange masses were celebrated. He hired alchemists, necromancers, astrologers. He spent fortunes on obscure rituals. He claimed to seek the secret of transmutation, gold, power, immortality. But something else seemed to consume him. A hunger that no banquet satisfied, a thirst that no wine quenched, and a transformation that no one understood. A servant named Henriette Griot, later a witness at the trial, would describe the nights at Tiffauges Castle as disturbed by screams that did not seem human. Another servant, Etienne Kohilauchi, known as Poitou, would claim to have seen the marshal, covered in blood, with eyes that were no longer those of a man, but of a hungry beast. And a third servant, whose identity was kept secret, reported that during certain full moon nights, the Baron locked himself in the dungeons, and what was heard from there were howls, not screams. The peasants began calling Gilles de Retz Bluebeard, not because of the color of his beard, which was brown, but because of something in his eyes, something cold, bluish, dead, like the gaze of a hungry wolf. And the children continued to disappear. 10, 20, 50, 100. No one knew exactly, but everyone knew that something monstrous inhabited those castles, and no one dared confront it until one child disappeared too many, the son of a minor nobleman. And this Chimi, the father, demanded justice. He sought the Duke of Brittany. He sought the Bishop of Nantes. And for the first time, someone with enough power decided to investigate what really happened inside the domains of the Marshal de Retz. In September 1440, the Serjeant Arms Jean Lab received an order that made him tremble. Arrest Gilles de Retz, invade his castles, discover the truth. Lab chose 20 men, the bravest, the most loyal, because everyone knew that confronting the marshal was not just a matter of strength. It was confronting something that perhaps was no longer completely human. They arrived at Machecoul Castle at noon. The gate was closed. The walls silent. Lab knocked and announced his authority. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the gate opened, and Gilles de Retz appeared in the courtyard, dressed in black armor, sunken eyes, face pale as wax. When he heard the sergeant's name, Lab, he stopped, went pale, made the sign of the cross, and, to everyone's astonishment, surrendered without a fight. Later, interrogated, Gilles would explain his surrender. Years before, an Italian astrologer named Francesco Prelati had made a prophecy. He had said that the marshal would one day fall into the hands of an Aegidii, had interpreted this as abbot, a religious man. He spent years avoiding monasteries, despising bishops, keeping distance from the church, but when he heard the name, Lab, he understood. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Destiny had caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to run. The soldiers invaded the castle. What they found in the dungeons of Machecoul made grown men vomit bones, hundreds of small bones, from children, blood-stained clothes, chains fixed to the walls, and something worse. In the deepest cells, they found claw marks, not claws made by tools, biological claws, deep scratches in the stone, as if something with superhuman strength had tried to escape, or as if something human had tried to free itself from a transformation it could not control. The inventory of horrors was recorded by the scribe Guillaume. He noted every detail, every bone, every blood stain, and the final discovery, which would be kept secret for decades. In Gilles' personal chamber, they found a book, a grimoire, written partly in Latin, partly in an unknown language, and in the central pages, an illustration, the image of a man transforming into a wolf. Below the image, a phrase in Latin, "When the moon governs, the beast awakens," and a signature Gilles de Laval, Baron de Retz. The trial began on October 19th, 1440, at Nantes Castle. Gilles was formally accused of heresy, invocation of demons, murder, and sacrilege. But among the judicial documents kept today in the National Archives of France, there is an additional accusation written in the margin of the main indictment in almost illegible handwriting. The accusation read, "Transformation against nature," and the prosecutor who wrote it added a note. According to witnesses, the accused assumed predatory form during the crimes, losing all human resemblance. The trial lasted weeks. 48 witnesses were called: parents of disappeared children, servants who worked in the castles, neighbors who heard the nocturnal screams, and 3 key witnesses: Ile Close's servants, Henriette Poitou, and the alchemist Prelati. All confirmed the crimes, but something more disturbing emerged from the testimonies. The description of a transformation. Henriette reported, "During certain nights, the Marshal locked himself in the North Tower and forbade us from approaching. The screams that came from there were not human, and when he came out at dawn, he was covered in blood, exhausted, like someone who had fought a battle with himself." Poitou added, "Once I saw him through the crack of the door. He was leaning over a child's body, but he was not using a knife. He was using his teeth, and his eyes were not the eyes of the man I knew. They were the eyes of a hungry wolf." Prelati, the alchemist, tried to defend himself, saying he only followed orders, but when pressed, he confessed to having prepared transformation ointments at Gilles' request. Ointments made with hallucinogenic herbs, human fat, and blood. And he admitted having read to Gilles passages from ancient grimoires, which spoke of him who lost human form during blood rituals and assumed the nature of the beast. When the judge asked if Gilles really believed he was transforming into a wolf, Prelati answered, "He did not believe, my larger judge. He knew, because I saw him." And then came the question no one expected. The Bishop of Nantes, Jean de Malestroit, looked directly at Gilles de Retz and asked, "Lord Baron, during your crimes did you consider yourself still human? Or did something else inhabit you? Gilles raised his head. For the first time in weeks, his eyes filled with tears, and he answered with a broken voice, "I no longer know, Your Excellency. When the hunger came, I was no longer myself. I was something hungry, something that could not be satisfied, something that, if it had a name, could only be called beast." The court fell silent, and in that silence, the truth finally emerged. Gilles de Retz was not just a murderer. He was a man who believed he had become a monster. And perhaps, he really had. Gilles de Retz's confession did not come all at once. It came in layers, as if each word tore a piece from his soul. On October 21st, 1440, after 2 days of uninterrupted interrogation, he finally gave in. But what he revealed was so disturbing that the bishop ordered that only selected scribes record the words. The rest of the court was evacuated. Only 10 people heard the complete confession, and what Gilles said in that room would forever change how the Church understood the connection between cannibalism, demonic possession, and lycanthropy. Gilles began describing the year 1430, 2 years after Joan of Arc's death. He had returned to his castles, devastated, not just by the loss of the young warrior he admired, but by something deeper. During military campaigns, Gilles had experienced something that frightened him: pleasure in carnage, not the strategic pleasure of military victory, but something visceral, primitive. He described how, during battles, he felt a strange hunger upon seeing the enemy's blood, how his heart raced not from fear, but from excitement, and how, after each combat, he needed days to feel human again. Back at his castles, isolated, obsessed with alchemy and black magic, Gilles began seeking answers. He hired Francesco Prelati, a young Florentine alchemist who claimed to know ancient transmutation rituals. Prelati brought with him forbidden books, grimoires, that had been banned by the Church, and among them, a manuscript that would change everything: the Liber An, Arabic text, translated into Latin, which described animal transformation rituals through the consumption of human blood and flesh during specific lunar phases. Gilles confessed that initially he did not believe the transformation was literal. He thought it was symbolic, an alchemical metaphor for spiritual transmutation. But Prelati convinced him to try. He said that only through total breaking of divine law could a man transcend his human nature and achieve absolute power. And so it was that, on a full moon night in September 1430, Gilles de Retz committed his first ritual murder. The victim was 12 years old. He was the son of a peasant who worked on his lands. Gilles lured him to the castle with the promise of a job as a page. And that night, following the grimoire's instructions, he executed the ritual. What happened afterwards, according to his own words, cannot be described by human tongue without blasphemy. The court recorded every word of Gilles' confession, but the most detailed documents were immediately sealed by the Church. Only 3 copies were made. One remained in another was sent to the Vatican. The third disappeared. For centuries, historians believed the complete confession had been destroyed. But in 1852, French historian Ludovico Hernandez discovered in the secret archives of the Vatican Apostolic Library a manuscript titled Confessio Aegidii Retz, de Transformatione Diabolica, the Complete Confession, and what was written there confirmed the worst. Gilles described that, after the first ritual murder, something inside him changed. Literally, he reported that during the ritual he felt a piercing pain run through his entire body, as if the bones were rearranging themselves, that his hands seemed stronger, the nails sharper, that his senses became sharpened in a superhuman way, and that, for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. But there was a price. The transformation was not complete. It was not permanent. It was a half-form, as he described it, human in appearance, but bestial in essence. With each full moon, the hunger returned, and with it, the need to repeat the ritual. Gilles confessed to having murdered over 8 years, between 140 and 200 children. He did not know the exact number, because during the rituals, he lost track of time. He lost his memory. He would wake hours later, covered in blood, with fragments of memories he preferred to forget. His servants, Henriette and Poitou, were forced to clean the remains, to burn the body, to keep the secret under penalty of death. And both confirmed, in their own testimonies, that the marshal, during those nights, did not act like a man. He acted like a predator. But the most disturbing confession came when Gilles described what he felt during the transformations. He said, "It was not I who killed. It was something inside me, something the moon awakened, something that had its own hunger, its own will. I watched from within, like a prisoner of my own body, while the beast did what it would do." And when the bishop asked if he believed he was possessed by demons, Gilles answered, "I do not know if it was a demon, Your Excellency, but I know I was no longer completely human, and that if the moon had not stopped calling me, I would never have stopped." The bishop noted that last phrase with a trembling hand, and beside it he wrote a word in Latin, lycanthropy. Gilles de Retz's defense tried to argue insanity. His lawyers claimed that the marshal suffered from profound melancholy after Joan of Arc's death, that he had been manipulated by the alchemist Prelati, and that his confessions were the result of psychological torture. But there was a problem. Gilles had not been tortured. On the contrary, out of respect for his former position, he had been treated with dignity uncommon for the time, fed, housed in a clean cell, authorized to confess before trial, and even so, he had confessed voluntarily, in detail, as if he needed to purge the truth before dying. The public prosecutor, Guillaume Chapelon, argued that the transformation described by Gilles was not demonic possession, but something worse, a deliberate choice to renounce humanity in exchange for power. Chapelon cited ancient texts, including passages from the Malleus, which described how certain sorcerers voluntarily assumed bestial form through pacts with the devil. And he specifically cited the case of Pierre Bergat and Michel Verdun, two French peasants executed in 1521 on charges of lycanthropy, who had also confessed to using ointments and lunar rituals to transform themselves into wolves. But there was a crucial difference. Bergat and Verdun were ignorant peasants. Gilles de Retz was one of the most educated men in France. He had commanded armies. He had lived with kings. He had fought alongside a saint. If even a man like him could fall into such bestiality, what did that say about human nature? The court faced a profound theological question. Was Gilles possessed, or had he simply revealed the monster that dwells in every man when moral restraints are removed? The alchemist Prelati tried to save his own life by blaming Gilles entirely. He said he only followed orders. that he did not really believe in the rituals, that everything was staging to satisfy the Marshal's madness. But when confronted with the grimoire found in the castle, and with the notes in his own handwriting describing successful transformations, Prelati collapsed. He confessed to having conducted 17 different lunar rituals. He confessed to having prepared metamorphosis ointments using the victim's fat mixed with hallucinogenic herbs, and he confessed, finally, that he himself had witnessed Gia lose all appearance of human rationality and attack victims with animal ferocity, using only teeth and claws. The court recorded Prelati's testimony as evidence of demonic pact with the purpose of bestial transmutation, and, for the first time in a European trial, the word werewolf was officially used in a legal context, not as metaphor, but as factual description of crimes on October 25th, 1440. Gilles de Retz was found guilty of all charges: heresy, demonic invocation, sodomy, murder of children, and, in a special clause added by the Bishop of Nantes, transformation against nature through forbidden arts. The sentence was death by hanging and incineration. But before execution, Gilles made a final request. He wanted to speak publicly. He wanted the people to hear a final confession. The bishop hesitated, but agreed. On October 26th, a crowd of more than 1,000 people gathered in Place des Buffets. In Nantes, a scaffold had been erected. 3 ropes hung from the beams, one for Gilles, one for Henriette, one for Poitou. The 3 were led to the stage Gilles wore. Simple clothes, no armor, no coat of arms, stripped of all titles, just a condemned man. But when he began to speak, his voice echoed across the square with authority that no sentence could remove. Gilles confessed his crimes again. He asked forgiveness from the victims' families. He begged them to pray for his soul. But then he said something the bishop did not expect. He said, "I sinned against God and against men. But I want you to know that the monster who committed these crimes was not born only from me. It was born from something we all carry: hunger, the thirst for power, the will to transcend divine law. I only had the courage to go where most dare not, and for this I pay the price. But do not believe the monster dies with me. It is in each of you, asleep, waiting for the right moon to awaken." The crowd fell silent. Some cried. Others shouted insults. But everyone understood the warning. Gilles was not just confessing crimes. He was confessing a truth about human nature, and that truth was more terrifying than any werewolf from fairy tales, because it suggested that the monster does not come from outside. It is not possession. It is not a curse. It is choice. It is the part of us that, when released from the chains of morality and religion, proves capable of any atrocity. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Gilles de Retz was hanged. His body was not burned immediately, as was customary for heretics. Through his family's intervention, he was allowed to receive Christian burial, but only after a final examination. The doctors who prepared the body for burial recorded something strange. Gilles' hands were deformed, the nails abnormally elongated and thick, the canine teeth more prominent than they should be, and around the mouth old scars that appeared to have been caused by ... bites. As if at some point he had bitten himself with enough force to leave permanent marks. The medical report was attached to the trial file, and beneath it a handwritten note The body shows signs compatible with partial transformation. Immediate burning recommended to avoid spiritual contagion. The family managed to prevent incineration, but the body was buried in unconsecrated ground outside the church walls. As if, even in death, Gilles de Retz could not be completely absolved of the beast he had chosen to become. For centuries, the story of Gilles de Retz was told as a moral tale. The nobleman who fell into disgrace, the hero who became villain, the inspiration for the legend of Bluebeard, the feudal lord who murdered his wives and hid the bodies in a secret chamber. But the truth was more complex and more disturbing. Because Gilles de Retz was not just a serial killer. He was a documented case of judicial lycanthropy. One of the first men in modern history accused, tried, and executed not just for homicide, but for bestial transformation. The trial files remained sealed for 400 years. Only in 1845 were they partially opened to the public, and when historians finally had access to the complete documents, they discovered something unsettling. Gilles was not an isolated case. During the 15th century, there were at least 30 similar trials in France. Men and women accused of transforming into wolves, of attacking children, of eating human flesh. And in almost all cases, the accused confessed voluntarily. They described rituals, they named accomplices. And they reported with disturbing details the sensation of ceasing to be human during transformations. The question that haunted historians for centuries remains without definitive answer. Did Gilles de Retz really believe he was transforming into a wolf? Or was he just a man with severe psychological disorders who used lycanthropy as justification for his crimes? French psychiatrist Jean Isquirot in 1802 studied the case and concluded that Gilles suffered from homicidal mania with zootropic delusions. But other specialists, including anthropologist Claude from the University of Sorbonne, argue that Gilles was embedded in a culture that genuinely believed in the possibility of human transformation, and that his crimes must be understood in that context. What cannot be denied is the case's impact. After Gilles de Retz's execution, werewolf trials exploded in Europe. Between 1450 and 1650, more than 30,000 people were executed on charges of lycanthropy, mostly in France, Germany, and Eastern Europe, and many of the trials cited Gilles' case as legal precedent. He had established, unintentionally, the legal basis for mass persecution of supposed werewolves. His confession, his detailed descriptions, his rituals, all of this was used as a model to identify, try, and execute thousands of people in the following 2 centuries. And if this story frightens you, it is because it should. Because Gilles de Retz was not the last. He was not even the worst. He was just the most famous. And his story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the monster is not out there in the dark forests or on full moon nights. The monster is within, sleeping, waiting. And sometimes, when the right circumstances align, war, trauma, isolation, hunger for power, it awakens not with claws and fur, but with choices. Choices that transform men into predators and heroes into nightmares. In the next chapter of Lost Legends, we will dive into world folklore, werewolves in every culture, where we will discover how the fear of bestial transformation is not exclusive to Europe, but crosses continents, religions, and millennia. Prepare to meet the Rakshasas of India, the Nawal of Mexico, and the Aswang of the Philippines. Because sometimes what seems like legend is just the part of history that has not yet been told.